So we'll kind of get back in the groove here. We're studying Proverbs, and today we're going to start with the 19th verse. Probably won't finish the 17th chapter today. There's a lot of good information here to talk about, but we'll continue to follow Solomon's wisdom for things that we can absolutely apply to our lives today, because the things that he's talking about here are pretty timeless. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis to lead our minds in prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we humbly bow before Thee, thanking You, Father, for the night of rest that You have allowed us to have. Thanking You, Father, for this opportunity to gather together in this class. We pray, Father, as we go through this study, that each and every one of us will glean something from it. We will use it to be better servants for Thee. We, David, as he breaks the bread of life to us, give You the revelation He needs. We present a lesson able and best for all of us. Go with us through this service. We thank You for Your Son, Jesus. We seek His name.
All right, so let's look at verse 19, chapter 17. He loveth transgression that loveth strife. He that raises high his gate seeketh destruction. So the word strife here is arguing and just doing things to put distance between people and causing some type of deep-seated disagreement. I think this is something, today we could probably all relate to, because if there's nothing else going on, there's a lot of strife going on in our country and throughout the world. So we see here that a lover of sin is identified as someone who loves this kind of bickering and hatred. And there's people out there that they live just to cause problems and keep people fighting among themselves. And they take great joy in this. Now the phrasing here is what's referred to in English as an inverted expression, implying that those who love to create strife are expressing a love of sin. And if you want to kind of put it another way, it's kind of like this: the one who shouts in pain is the one who stubs his toe. That's kind of the way, that's an example of this inverted expression here. And those who make a point of causing trouble are participating in an ungodly practice, because God doesn't like strife either. So this verse refers to a particular type of division causer, calling them someone who makes his door high. And this also translates as one who raises his door or builds a high threshold. So the imagery here is of someone who makes it the entrance to their home especially ornate, or raises it above his neighbors, pretty much just to show off. And that's what we're talking about here, is someone who just goes out of their way to show off. And literally it means raise the threshold. It can be dangerous to do something like this. An overly luxurious feature can invite scrutiny from tax collectors and robbers. You build your house, you make it too fancy, and the assessor drives by and says, "Wow, man, that's a nice house. They've just done a whole lot of stuff. Let's raise their property taxes a few $100s just for the luxury of having that real nice facade on their house."
We don't have to do that anymore.
Well, that's true too. But and also, it kind of attracts robbers and people who have bad intentions. They see this and they say, "Wow, there may be something in there for me to have." But more generally, this is a person who brags about themselves, and by bragging, they invite disaster upon themselves. Now, a good example of this would be King Nebuchadnezzar, and in Daniel's writings. Of course, the prophet Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, telling him that he would be humbled until he properly acknowledged the Most High God. This is back in the 4th chapter of Daniel, verses 24 and 25. And we know that a year later, Nebuchadnezzar walked in his royal home and boasted about his power and ability to build cities and palaces. But then suddenly a voice from heaven told him that the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts in the field, and you shall be made to eat the grass like ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. This is Daniel 4:31 and 32. So, Nebuchadnezzar, he was living high on the hog, and he was, heaping all kinds of praise. He was making himself a legend in his own mind. And then all of a sudden, the Lord God humbled him, and he was out eating the grass with the ox. So, you go from great feast out there eating grass with the ox. That's taking somebody pretty low. So we see that this prediction came true. And Nebuchadnezzar, become a very vivid example of pride that leads to ruin. There's a lot of people out there that, they're real quick to tell you how good they are. Well, that's all well and good. The thing is, show me how good you are. And if you can show how good you are, then you've got a reason to say a little bit. But even at that, if you look at the truly great people who do really great things, most of them are pretty humble. They don't sit there and pound on their chest and say, "Hey, look at me! Look what I've done." And those are not the people you got to worry about. It's the people that build up all these expectations, and all of a sudden they're not able to perform. And that's the type of people that we're talking about here. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on then to verse 20. He that hath a wayward heart findeth no good, and he that hath a perverse tongue falleth unto mischief. So the teaching uses the same root word as in Proverbs 2 and 5, Proverbs 8 and 8, and Proverbs 11 and 12. And it's going to be repeated again in the 19th and the 22nd and 28th chapter. Now the term here in the original language was ikes, I-Q-Q-E-S. And it's often translated as crooked or perverse, and it carries a sense of manipulation, somebody who wants to manipulate people. And such people aren't inclined to look for the good. They don't find it. They're not inclined to look for the good. And that includes their approach to life and how they view other people. And it also means that they're not seeking God. So Solomon insists in this verse that a man whose heart is crooked, inclined away from God, and he does not find any good in anything, because his motives and morals are bad. He cannot expect blessings from God, and furthermore, his lips dispense lies. And you've probably heard me say lots of times that with a politician, the only way that you can tell if they're lying is to see if their mouth's moving. And you know that there's people out there that you can't believe a word that they say. It sounds good, but when you really break it down and you see what actually happens, the truth is absolutely not in them. So ultimately, this is corrupt and a deceitful person, and they're going to find trouble. Eventually, they may skate by for a while, but eventually they're going to find trouble. All they do is they sit and they lie. So wicked people may think that they are faring well and able to blaspheme God without incurring his judgment, but they're mistaken. They may escape things here on the earth, but in the end, the judgment is going to be there, and God's going to punish them. Maybe not today, but when in God's due time, the punishment is going to come. Now, an example is Apha, the psalmist describes evil people of his era, and he poetically depicts them as wearing pride like a necklace and violence as a garment, scoffing and speaking with malice, threatening oppression, and settling their mouths against the heavens. This is Psalms 73, 6 through 9. And he struggles with this only to remember that wicked, blasphemous people will fall under God's hand of judgment. And he writes that God's will make them fall to ruin. This is in verse 18 of the same psalm. And he exclaims at how they are destroyed in a moment, swept away utterly by terrors, like a dream when one awakes. O Lord, when you rouse yourself, you despise them that as phantoms. So we see here that these people, they're going to fall into ruin eventually. It may take some time, but they're going to get their reward. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 21. He that beggeth a fool doeth it to his sorrow, and the father of a fool hath no joy. So Solomon observes in this verse that a father of a foolish son has sorrow but no joy. And this echoes other statements about how ungodly children bring shame and stress to their families. And we've talked about this in chapter 10, chapter 17, and we're going to talk about it in chapter 19 and 25. This is a theme all the way through Solomon's writing. So the scripture includes at least two Hebrew root words translated into English as fool. Now these are very closely related with only subtle difference in the meaning, if there is any. The first word is Kesil, Kesil. And this is the word used that we translate as fool in chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 15, verse 20, chapter 17, verse 10, and in Psalms 49 and 10. And it can imply either spiritual or intellectual dullness. Now the second word is Nabal, Nabal. An example of it is in Proverbs 17 and 7, and we're going to look at it in the 30th chapter, and then in Psalms 14 and 1, which more often refers to spiritual arrogance or lack of sense. And he is using both of these words for fool in the same verse. He's really trying to drive home a point here about the problems of being foolish. So when a child is born, obviously the parents rejoice, but later if the child becomes a disobedient child, a disobedient teenager, an adult, he not only disappoints his parents, but he grieves them deeply. You have a kid that's nothing but a troublemaker, it grieves the parents. And it doesn't just grieve the dad, it grieves the mother also. And they will not hopefully stop loving that son or daughter. There are cases where it is so bad that they disown the child, and that's a bad situation also. No matter how they turn out, you got to love your kids. And yeah.
They sure did.
Yeah.
And the parents had to throw the first stone. That would be a horrible thing.
Right. And, you have to wonder, of course, sometimes the parents may contribute to it, but sometimes, no matter what the parents do, the child turns out that way.
There's so much in this verse, both Solomon's life and for today, of course, on front of Solomon, is that unfortunately he experienced a lot that he is discussing here, because he had children who, I don't really know that they were godless, but they were ones who
Very worldly.
Well, they were revolted. They revolted against him, and certainly they fought over his power near the end of his life. And of course, it was disastrous for God's people. But of course, in today's, you get the image here of the unfaithful child, and
When you look at David's son Absalom, he brought nothing but heartache and trouble for his father. He rebelled against David. He stole the hearts of the people from David. He tried to overthrow David, and they tried to take his place as king. I mean, just about every bad thing that you could do, Absalom was right there, doing
Also
it.
challenging Solomon's proper right.
Right. And David grieved over this, betrayal, and, he sobbed when his son was killed. He still loved him, but, it was, I'm sure that was a hard thing to do, was to, to continue to love your son after they'd done all of that. And many godly parents do their best to guide a son or daughter into being someone who loves and obeys the Lord, but they, encounter grief when their child, goes a different way, and this happens quite a bit. Comments about those verses? All right, we're going to start another section here. Verses 20 through to 28 pretty much continue Solomon's wise sayings, and he commands a joyful heart, a calm spirit, and a controlled speech, but he points out the bad effects of sin, of negativity, bribery, and imposing fines on righteous people, and opposing the righteous. So let's look at verse 22, starting out. A cheerful heart is a good medicine, but a broken spirit drieth up the bones. So Solomon offers some pretty sound medical advice in this verse, and a person's attitude affects his outlook on life and even his health. There are people that, have some pretty serious illness, but they have a great outlook on life. And, it's not only uplifting to them, but it's uplifting to the people who take care of it. They have such a good attitude, and they don't let their physical problems, ruin their life, and they keep on living and try to be a productive type of person. And when you get sick, the attitude that you have toward recovering is a very important part. If you just don't feel like you don't care if you're going to recover or not, well, you know what, you're probably not going to. And I've known a lot of times, I'm sure everybody in this room knows people that have had very serious illness, and things look really bad, but because of their good attitude and the fight that they make, they overcome it. And this is just a really important verse as far as how we should look toward the negative things in our life and try to turn the negatives into a positive.
If you want to boil it down, Solomon is saying, be optimistic, not fatalist.
Right. So, if somebody is joyful, negative circumstances don't knock them off balance and cause them to despair. And over the centuries, medicine has become more and more aware of the influence of a person's happiness has on their overall health. And, there are treatment programs that people go through that a very important part of that treatment program is their mental health and their mental outlook of how to face this disease or whatever the disease particularly is, and overcome it and still have a good life. So the ultimate source of our joy here is found in a relationship with Christ. The believer can rejoice in the Lord as Paul did even when he was a prisoner in Rome. I mean, he was in some pretty dire situations, but he did not let them get him down, and he looked to the Lord for strength, and he saw past the present and saw into the future and the reward that was going to be there for him, and that helped keep his attitude in the right way. So from his imprisonment he urged the Philippians believers rejoice in the Lord. This is in Philippians 3:1 and verse 4 and 4. And instead of looking around at the circumstances, a joyful believer looks to the Lord and rejoices in him. But in contrast, being mentally beaten down leads to the physical symptoms of severe depression. And whoever fails to look to God and his faithfulness and goodness become joyless, and and they lose hope. And it's very easily when something bad happens to you that you can get depressed. And just because you get depressed doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. I think that everybody in certain situations get a little bit depressed. The thing is how you deal with that depression. Do you use it as a positive and overcome it, or do you just let it drive you completely crazy to the point where sometimes you just want to kill yourself? And having dealt over the years in lots of cases with people who have tried to commit suicide and things like that, you sit there and talk to them a little bit, and deep down they really don't want to kill themselves, but they see no way out. And that's a bad situation to be in when you get so low that you see no way out other than killing yourself. And it's just a really bad situation. So a crushed spirit produces ill health and perhaps high blood pressure, ulcers, lack of energy, heart disease, or just a general malaise. People just kind of walk around in a malaise, and their lights are on but nobody's home type of situation. Yeah, kind of like a zombie. And the Apostle James advocated for a resilient spirit even in the face of trials. And he writes in James 1 and 2, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet with trials of various kinds." So, the way that we train ourselves to overcome these problems are going to have a lot to do with, how we're going to continue on when something bad happens. And there's a lot of bad things that could happen out there, and it doesn't matter how good you are, there's going to be bad things happen to you, and you've got to be mentally prepared for that, and you've got to have a plan that's got God in it to help you get through those situations. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 23. "A wicked man receiveth a bride out of the bosom to pervert the ways of justice." So other statements in the book of Proverbs note that bribes sometimes work. We talked about this, back in verse 8, and we'll talk about it again in chapter 21, verse 4. This is not an endorsement of them, as it shows, in verse 29 and 4. Bribes happen out there. Sometimes, good things come out of these bribes, but doesn't make it honest, and it doesn't make the Bible endorsing this. So this proverb connects accepting bribes with a warping of justice. And a government official might accept a bribe and declare a guilty person innocent, or give undue support to some cause. And if you read the history of the state of West Virginia, there's been a lot of things that's happened with a brown bag full of money, and some of it good and some of it bad. But I've kind of figured out that it may be good at the beginning, but it always ends up bad at the end. So doing something like this, making a bribe, is a perversion of truth, and it discredits the person who should decide the matter according to objective law. You go bribe a judge. The judge is supposed to be objective. He's supposed to call balls and strikes. He's not supposed to lean one way or the other. He's supposed to be, right down the middle. Well, then, you got the scales of justice there, and you put a couple little coins on the one side, and it kind of has it tilt the other way. And this is a discredit to that person who takes the bribe. That's not the way that things should be done. In 1 Samuel 1 and 8 reports that Samuel appointed his sons judges over Israel, but Samuel's sons were wicked, and they pursued wealth instead of truth. They above having their palms greased a little bit when they were making a decision. And this, of course, we know that they accepted bribes. And by doing so, they perverted justice, using the phrase very similar to the one that's contained in this proverb. They're perverting things because of that bribe. Now, earlier, Eli's son became the object of God's judgment when they did evil to the people of Israel from their position as priests. They were unduly influenced, and as a result, they made poor decisions, and they put the people of Israel in a position where evil things were done to them. Now the Philistines defeated Israel, captured the ark and Eli's two sons, and of course they both died. We can read about this in 1 Samuel 4 and 11. And in Amos 5, the Lord pronounces judgment on the house of Israel for its sin, and one of the sins that he pronounced judgment for was bribery. And he says, "For I know how many are your transgressions and how great your sins, you who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe and turn aside the needy at the gate." This is an abomination in the sight of God, that when somebody takes a bribe and doesn't do what's right because of that money that they're taking. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 24. Wisdom is before the face of him that hath understanding, but the eyes of a fool are in the ends of the earth. So Solomon uses a contrast here to make another point about wisdom. And the first phrase seems to be a figure of speech parallel to the English expression right in the front of your face. It's right there for you to see. And those with understanding or discernment are described using words related to those seen in other proverbs. And this alternately translates to suggest that discerning people aim their faces toward what is wise, or that wise conclusions are obvious to the discerning person. You look at the situation and you obviously see right up front, this is what's right. Nobody has to explain it to you. It's right there. And then on the other hand, when you're in a situation where you're in a doubt what to do, you want to seek the counsel of somebody who's wise and can give you sound advice. But in contrast, the fool, a person who rejects godly wisdom, fails to see what is wise. They don't see wise if it hits them in the top of the head. They don't have the ability to see that, either because they're stupid or they don't want to see the wise thing. Either he looks everywhere else or wisdom is beyond his sight. And this proverb also reinforces the idea that God makes his truth in a broad sense available for all to see. The gospel is out there for all to see. It's not really that complicated. It's easy to read, but some people don't want to see it. Some people see it and don't want to believe it. And some people, they see it, they kind of believe it, but it doesn't suit what they want to do, so they kind of twist it around to meet their own needs. In Romans 1:18 and 32 describes what happens when people foolishly ignore God and seek answers everywhere else. And Paul's comment fits the pattern of ungodly, insincere pursuit of preferences rather than truth. And even more specific information can be found because God makes it available to those who seek it. And before the Israelites entered Canaan, the Lord told them that his commandments was not hard to find. He said, "For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it afar off." That's in Deuteronomy 30 and 11. And he advised them that they did not have to search in heaven or the sea, for this truth. It was right there in plain sight. And he says, but the word is very near you. It is in your mouth. It is in your heart, so that you can do it. So the Lord would give the Israelites the knowledge of his will. It was right there. All they had to do was follow the things that God, told them to do. And the Word of God gives believers understanding and knowledge so that they can know what God's will is. And it is wise, therefore, to let the Word dwell in us richly. And if we do that, we're going to see it very clearly when the situation comes up, when we need to do something, we want to do the right thing. We're instinctively going to know what to do because we've got it in our heart, we've got it in our mind. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 25. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bear him. So this verse repeats the prior thought back in the 21st verse, but with a little bit stronger emphasis. Verse 21 carries the idea of sorrow and worry. And the term used here, translated as grief, lends more to the idea like offense and anger. And the idea that ungodly children bring pain to their families is a common refrain in the book of Proverbs. We've talked about this, pretty much all the way through. And because a father is supposed to instruct his children in the ways of the Lord, he is deeply grieved when a foolish son rebels against his teaching and turns away from the Lord. And a mother experiences bitterness if her son spurns her tender care and love. So the father of the prodigal must have felt great sorrow when his son demanded his inheritance and left, for a sinful life. But we also see, though, that, even though he did all of that, in the very end, the father still loved the son. And when he came back, he loved him just as much when he came back as before he left. So children raised in Christians' home may yield to peer pressure and anti-Christian philosophy. And there's a lot of peer pressure and there's a lot of anti-Christian philosophy that's out there these days. And some sadly cast aside the teaching and the influence of godly parents. And of course, a father may provoke his children through improper actions, and parents bear responsibility for how they treat their children, even if a child's response is part of their free choice. So in some ways, it's a two-way street. The child has a responsibility, but the parents have a responsibility also. Comments about that verse? All right, let's finish up with verse 26 today. Also, to punish the righteous is not good, nor to smite the noble for their uprightness. So in this verse, Solomon condemns the government official who punishes a righteous person for doing what is proper. And in Solomon's era, the only one who could strike a noble were more highly exalted noblemen or kings. So this proverb also rebukes higher ranking officials who punish lower officers for acting with integrity. And this fits with other statements denouncing perversions of justice. And it's immoral and shameful for those in power to use their position to attack those who do good. And whether it is inspired by greed or spite, it's a despicable act. And, if you want to see this, just turn the news on. This goes on all the time. And, we've got a lot of problems in our government. And if it was up to me, I'd clean them all out and flush them down the commode, because there's none of them worth saving.
We see around the world, too.
Yeah, it's not just here. It's everywhere. And such practices are not only sinful, but they create deep resentment. You look at all the resentment that you see with all these politicians and stuff today, You know, I think sometimes they've kind of lost the point of why they, you know, of who they're serving. And it's a bad situation all the way around, and they're all guilty of it in my estimation. So after Solomon's death, the Israelites asked Solomon's son and successor Rehoboam to lighten the people's financial burden. And some apparently thought Solomon's taxes were excessive. You can read about this in 1 Kings 12, 1 through 5. So Rehoboam sought advice from Solomon's advisors, and they suggested a tax reduction to help the people. But instead, Rehoboam followed the cruel advice of his buddies, and to flaunt his power and authority, he instead made taxes much higher. And while the taxes are not the same thing as fines, harsh taxation and unjust fees are as unfair as a heavy burden on the citizens. So Rehoboam chose to lead the division of the entire kingdom. All right, comments about that verse. Well, let's move on to verse 27. He that spareth his word hath knowledge, and he that is of a cool spirit is a man of understanding. So once again, the scriptures applaud the person who knows how to control his tongue. And this is a two-part message that implies more than just someone who literally keeps their mouth shut, but rather this is a person who chooses not to speak words without carefully considering what those words are. And a cool spirit is the opposite of being hot-tempered. Such a person knows when to mind their speech and when to speak their mind. They say the right thing at the right time. And it has been observed that God has given each of us 2 ears, but only 1 mouth. And we've talked about lots of times. Therefore, as the saying goes, we should do twice as much listening as talking. And James writes, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." And it's not easy, and many people struggle with controlling their words. And uncontrolled speech is such a common problem that even foolish people can be seen wise just by saying nothing. And of course, Jesus' 2 disciples, James and John, had to learn to control their speech and discipline their spirit also. You know, John Kennedy, I love listening to this guy, one of the senator from Louisiana. He made a statement here a couple of days ago that God gave him the right to be silent, but he just didn't have the ability to do it. So, that's the thing about it. So, they were incensed at the residents of Samaria's village, and those people would not initially welcome Jesus. So they asked, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" And Jesus, on the other hand, demonstrated, a calm spirit, and he rebuked James and John, and then he and his disciples, they went elsewhere. All right, we got one more verse here. We're going to finish this chapter. "Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise. When he shutteth his lips, he is esteemed as prudent." So controlling one's word is difficult, and one must, common human errors is using inappropriate or poorly considered speech. And this is such a frequent issue that merely choosing to remain silent, to say nothing at all, gives the impression that you're smart. So even if someone is wallowing in stupidity and ignorance, those flaws are distinguished by their silence. And an English proverb rephrases this wisdom by saying, "It is better to be thought a fool and remain silent than speak up and remove all doubt." So we'll stop there, and we'll pick up next week in the next chapter. So appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.